In the winter of 1907, two boys walked out of a forest in rural Harlan County, Kentucky, alone, barefoot, and completely silent. They had been missing for 11 days. No one knew where they had been. No one knew what had happened to them. And when the local sheriff finally sat them down and asked them to describe what they had seen, the boys didn't speak. They picked up a pencil and they drew. What ended up on that paper made the sheriff leave the room. He never publicly spoke about what the twins drew. Not once. Not in any interview. Not in the county record. Not in the letters he wrote to his brother in Lexington. The only reason we know about those drawings at all is because of a single paragraph buried inside a 1923 deposition related to a completely unrelated land dispute, where a witness casually mentioned, as though everyone already knew, that the Vearn boys had drawn something that the sheriff had locked in the bottom drawer of his desk and refused to discuss until the day he died. This is the story of the Vearn twins, and once you hear it, you'll understand why it was buried for over a century. Before we dive in, press subscribe and let us know where in the world you are watching from. Harlan County in 1907 was not the kind of place where strange things were supposed to happen. It was coal country, hard country, the kind of place where men woke before sunrise and came home after dark and didn't have much patience for mystery. The mountains pressed in close around the small towns, and the forests between them were dense enough in winter that you could walk 50 feet off a trail and lose sight of everything. People who lived there knew those woods. They hunted in them, logged them, walked them in all seasons. They were not afraid of the dark between the trees. But they were afraid of certain places within those woods. Every community that old has them, spots that don't get named in polite conversation, hollows where the birds go quiet in the middle of the day, ridgelines where livestock refuse to graze no matter how short the grass gets on the safe side of the fence. These places accumulate stories the way old houses accumulate drafts. You can't always find the source, but you feel it. The Vearn family had been in Harlan County for 3 generations. Isaiah Vearn ran a small farm on the eastern edge of town, close enough to the tree line that on certain mornings the fog off the mountains would settle across his fields before it burned off. He and his wife, Clara, had 4 children. The twins, Walter and Edmund, were 9 years old in November of 1907. By every account, they were ordinary boys. Quiet, maybe. A neighbour named Mrs. Pruitt later recalled that neither of them talked much, that they communicated more with looks and gestures the way twins sometimes do, a private language that doesn't require sound. She said she always thought they were a little serious for their age. She said she thought that before she knew what had happened to them. On the morning of the 14th of November 1907, Walter and Edmund Vearn left their home after breakfast. Isaiah said he saw them walking toward the tree line at the back of the property, which was not unusual. The boys often went into the woods to set snares for rabbits, a chore their father had taught them the previous autumn. He didn't watch where they went. He went back to his work. Clara called them for lunch, and they didn't come. She called for supper, and they didn't come. By dark, Isaiah had walked the edge of the woods for 2 hours, calling their names into a forest that gave him nothing back but silence. He went to town that night and reported them missing to Sheriff Amos Cordill. The search lasted 11 days. Cordill organized it personally, pulling in men from 3 different precincts, volunteers from the local churches, and a pair of experienced trackers who had spent decades reading sign in these mountains. They covered the woods in a grid pattern, working from the Vearn property outward in expanding sections. They found the boys' snare line on the 2nd day. 1 snare had been tripped and the animal had gotten free, which meant the boys had been there at some point that first morning. Beyond the snare line, nothing. No footprints. No torn clothing on branches. No sign that 2 9-year-old boys had ever pushed deeper into those trees. On the 4th day, one of the trackers told Cordill he wanted to avoid a particular area to the northeast, a shallow depression in the terrain that locals called the Grey Bowl. He wouldn't give a specific reason. He said it was just a feeling. Cordill, who was a practical man, noted the request and pushed the searchline past it anyway. The tracker refused to enter that section. Cordill sent other men. They came back quickly and said there was nothing there. One of them, a young deputy named Thomas Pell, said the air in that hollow smelled wrong, like something electrical, like the air before a lightning strike, except there were no clouds. He said it made his teeth ache. He said he didn't want to go back in. They searched for 11 days. They found nothing. On November 25th, at approximately 6 in the morning, before the search parties had even assembled for the day, Walter and Edmund Vearn walked out of the tree line at the back of their father's property. They were barefoot. Their shoes were never recovered. Their clothing was intact, which search party members later found disturbing because 11 days in a winter forest should have destroyed it. They were not physically injured. They were not dehydrated. They showed no signs of exposure despite temperatures that had dropped below freezing on several nights during the 11 days they were gone. They were also, for the first several hours, completely mute. Clara Vearn later told a neighbour that when she ran to her boys that morning, when she grabbed them and held them, she felt something she couldn't name. She said they were warm, warmer than they should have been given the cold, which she took at first as relief. But she said they held her back differently than they used to. She said she couldn't explain it precisely. She said it was like embracing someone who had learned to hug by watching other people do it rather than by feeling it themselves. She said she tried to put that feeling out of her mind because they were home and they were safe, and a mother finds a way to believe that. Sheriff Cordial came to the Vearn house that afternoon. He spoke with Isaiah first, who confirmed that the boys had said almost nothing since returning, that they had eaten but without apparent hunger or pleasure, and that both of them had spent most of the morning standing at the back window looking out toward the tree line. Cordial then tried to speak with the boys directly. He asked them where they had been. Walter looked at him without expression and didn't answer. Edmund turned his face slowly toward the window. Cordial tried several more questions, different angles, different phrasings, the patient and practiced approach of a man who had spent years talking to frightened people. Nothing. Then he placed a piece of paper and a pencil on the kitchen table and told them they didn't have to talk. He told them they could just show him. What happened next was described by Cordial in the only account that survives from his perspective, that single paragraph in the 1923 deposition. The witness in that deposition was a man named George Farley, who had been present at the Vearn house that afternoon as a family friend. Farley's statement reads in part, "The Cordial asked the boys to draw what they saw, and both of them took up the pencil, one after the other, and drew the same thing without neither one seeing what the other had put down." Cordial looked at both papers and he went white as milk, and he folded them up and put them in his coat pocket, and he said he needed some air, and he went outside for a long while. When he came back, he would not show the drawings to Isaiah or to anyone else, and he said the boys needed rest, and he left. I never saw him speak of it again. Both boys, same drawing, without seeing each other's paper. Whatever they drew it from memory. The same memory, the same image, precise enough that a grown man with 2 decades of law enforcement experience walked out of a room and stood alone in a cold yard trying to decide what to do with what he had just seen. The 1923 deposition doesn't describe what the drawing showed. Farley, the witness, said only that it was the same image on both papers and that Cordial went white. He was not asked to describe it further, and the attorney conducting the deposition moved on to the matter of the land dispute that had brought everyone into that room in the first place. No one ever thought to go back and press Farley on the detail. He died in 1936. Whatever he saw over Cordial's shoulder that afternoon, whatever glimpse he caught before those papers were folded and pocketed, he took it with him. But Farley's statement does give us one thing to work with. He says Cordial went outside for a long while. Not a short while, not a moment, a long while. This is a man who walked into a farmhouse to question 2 children and ended up standing alone in a cold yard in November, needing time, needing air, needing distance from whatever was now inside his coat pocket. That detail tells us something. It tells us that whatever the boys drew was not ambiguous. It was not childlike scribbling that required interpretation. It was clear enough, specific enough, recognizable enough that Cordial's response was immediate and physical and could not be contained inside a room with other people. There are several possibilities for what the twins might have depicted, and researchers who have looked into this case over the decades have explored all of them. The most straightforward explanation is that the boys witnessed something human, something criminal, something that Cordial recognized and needed to handle quietly for reasons that had nothing to do with the supernatural. Harlan County in 1907 was no stranger to violence. The coal wars were still a decade away from their peak, but the tensions beneath them had been building for years. There were men in those mountains doing things that other men would have preferred to keep quiet. It's possible the Vearn boys stumbled into something they were never meant to see, were held somewhere for 11 days to keep them from talking, and were then released with some form of threat attached. It's possible Caudle recognized the imagery in those drawings as tied to something he was already aware of and needed to pursue through channels he couldn't explain to a grieving father in a farmhouse kitchen. That's the rational read. But there are details that resist it. The absence of physical deterioration across 11 days of winter exposure is the most immediately troubling. Children who are held by people do not typically emerge looking the way Walter and Edmund emerged. They do not emerge warm. They do not emerge with clothing intact. The trackers who had searched those woods found no structure, no shelter, no fire ring, no evidence of any location where two boys could have been kept alive through multiple nights of below freezing temperatures. The tracker who refused to enter the Grey Bowl was interviewed by a local newspaper in 1931, near the end of his life, and he said something that the reporter apparently considered too strange to print in full. A handwritten version of the interview survives in a private archive. In it, the tracker said that his refusal to enter that hollow was not about instinct the way he had told Caudle. He said he had been in that hollow before, years earlier, in summer, and that he had seen something standing at the centre of it that he had never been able to describe in words that sounded sane. He said it was tall. He said it had no clear edges. He said the air around it moved the way air moves over asphalt in August heat, that shimmer, that distortion, except the distortion went up a long way. He said he had run and had never gone back. He said when the Vearn boys went missing, he knew immediately, in the way a man knows certain things without being able to say why, that whatever was in that hollow had something to do with it. He said he would not go in there for any sheriff or any god. The newspaper editor who received the tracker's full interview chose to publish only a condensed version without the most specific details. In 1988, a historian who located the handwritten transcript described it as one of the most unsettling documents he had encountered in 30 years of regional research. He transcribed it in full but declined to publish it, citing an unwillingness to amplify something he could not verify and could not in good conscience dismiss. He donated his research files to a university archive in Tennessee. The tracker's original interview is listed in the catalogue. Researchers who have requested it since the early 2000s have been told the file cannot be located within the collection, though it remains listed. That pattern, the thing that exists in the record but cannot be retrieved, runs through this case like a thread. The drawings are gone. The contents of Caudle's locked drawer are gone. The attic box is gone. What remains are edges. Shadows of documents, second-hand accounts of things that people saw and then spent the rest of their lives trying to find words for. Edmund Vearn died in 1959. He never spoke publicly about the 11 days. In a letter to his daughter written shortly before his death, he mentioned the woods once. The letter has been partially shared by the family, with certain sections withheld. What they have shared includes the following. Edmund wrote that he and his brother were not afraid during the 11 days. He wrote that he thought about that for 50 years and still didn't know how to feel about it. He wrote that the thing they saw was not trying to harm them. He wrote that it was trying to understand them. He wrote that he and Walter had understood, even at 9 years old, even without words, that they were being studied the way you study something you have never encountered before and are not sure how to categorize. He wrote that the drawing was the only way he ever found to explain the shape of it, and that he had shown the drawing to exactly one other person in his life, a doctor in Lexington in 1944, and that the doctor had asked him to never show it to anyone again. Walter Vearn died in 1971. He left no written accounts. Sheriff Amos Caudle retired in 1919. He kept that locked desk drawer through his entire remaining tenure. When he cleaned out his office, his deputy Thomas Pell, the same young man who had smelled the electrical air in the Grey Bowl and felt his teeth ache, helped him move his belongings. Pell said that when they lifted the desk drawer out, Caudle took it from him immediately and would not let him carry it. Pell said Caudle loaded it into his wagon himself and drove home alone. Pell never learned what was in it. When Caudle died in 1931, his wife conducted the household estate. There is no inventory record of the drawer's contents. His grandson, interviewed by a regional historian in 1988, said he remembered as a child being told by his grandmother never to open a particular box in the attic. He said the box was not large. He said when his grandmother died, the box was not in the attic. He said he had looked. The grey bowl is still there. It sits inside what is now part of the Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, though it falls within a section rarely travelled by visitors because it lies off any marked trail. Park rangers who know the area have noted in internal reports that animals avoid it, not because of any identified environmental hazard, but for reasons that remain, in the dry language of those reports, undetermined. One report from 1,994 notes that a ranger conducting a survey of the area experienced a period of disorientation lasting approximately 20 minutes before finding her way back to the trail. She reported that during the disorientation she felt certain she was being observed, though she identified no person or animal in the surrounding forest. She reported that the air smelled like an electrical storm. She reported that her fillings ached. The Park Service report from 1,994 was never made public. It came to light only because a researcher submitted a Freedom of Information request in 2009. The ranger who wrote it had since transferred to a different district. When contacted, she confirmed the report's contents and added one detail she had not included in the official version. The 20 minutes of disorientation had felt, from the inside, like no time at all. She said that was the part she couldn't explain. She said when she finally found the trail again, she sat down on a log and counted the things she could see that were normal: trees, rocks, a strip of winter sky through the branches. And it had taken her longer than it should have to feel certain that the world around her was the one she had always lived in. She said she thought about the Vearn twins sometimes. There are things in this world that don't want to be understood. There are places where the boundary between what we know and what we have never been meant to know grows thin enough that something can slip through it, quietly, patiently, without any apparent anger. The Vearn twins were 9 years old when they walked into those trees, and whatever found them in that hollow was not, as Edmund wrote half a century later, trying to hurt them. It was trying to understand them. That is somehow worse. The idea that something vast and alien and entirely outside our frame of reference looked at two small boys in a Kentucky winter and felt curiosity, felt the need to study, felt the particular quiet attention of a thing that has all the time in the world and has simply never seen anything quite like us before. What those boys drew, each on a separate piece of paper, the same image without seeing each other's work, described something real, something they had both seen in the same moment, from the same angle, concrete enough to put on paper, recognizable enough that a seasoned sheriff, a man who had seen violence and death and the worst that people do to each other, went pale and folded those papers away and never spoke of them again. We don't know what the drawing showed. We may never know. But somewhere between the attic of the Cordill home and the bottom of a drawer that was never inventoried, the shape of it exists. And it was real enough to mark every person who glimpsed it for the rest of their lives. The doctor in Lexington who asked Edmund never to show anyone again. The tracker who wouldn't enter the hollow and spent his remaining years trying to describe something without edges. The ranger who felt eyes on her in an empty forest and whose teeth ached in the rain-free air. The Vearn twins were found in 1907. They were home, they were safe, they were warm, and they were never entirely the same again. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe. We cover cases like this every week, the ones that got buried, the ones that don't fit, the ones where the official record quietly runs out of words. Click the video on screen now.